Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you are going to be seeing a lot of World War I, Great War content in the coming weeks, as I am now just 5 weeks out from what I hope will be my first trip to Europe. The flight's booked. The rental car is booked. I'm in the process of booking my hotels. Now we just cross our fingers that nothing changes with the travel conditions. So with that in mind, I thought today we would go back to our friend Indy Nydell and the Great War channel and take a look. This title of this video really caught my attention when I was browsing through their video titles. I haven't seen it yet, but it's called "Why Didn't They Learn Anything from the American Civil War?" You know, a lot of people will say, and I would agree with this, that the last year or two of the American Civil War was a foreshadowing of the Great War in a lot of ways. The trench warfare, the way that the tactics were finally adjusting to the new weapons, the advent of an early version of the machine gun with the Gatling gun, the heavy use of artillery. All those kinds of things are starting to happen in the American Civil War. And so I'm curious to see what connections he makes between the two. So it'll be interesting to dive into this. As always, I encourage you to check out the Great War channel. I think it's one of the best YouTube channels as far as history goes on this platform. So I put a link in the description to this original content. I encourage you to check them out. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Hi, I'm Indy Nydell, and this is another episode of Out of the Trenches, which is our Great War special series where I answer all of you fantastic viewers' questions about World War I. Now, I usually sit in the chair of wisdom in Berlin, where we have the studio, and answer the questions. But these two guys came up to Stockholm to shoot some special episodes, and we thought we'd shoot some Out of the Trenches, so I'm sitting in my apartment in the chair of madness, much as I was last time, and I'm still going to answer your questions. And I'm not going to wing it. I actually wrote some down this time. I know that's cheating. Don't write to me about it. I already know you don't like it when I do that. Right? The Winged Hussar writes, ooh. I have a question.
Wait, let's just stop right there and admire the name. Yeah, that's pretty good.
Did any side during World War I actually research the tactics and situations during the U.S. Civil War to try and gain some kind of advantage, since the U.S. Civil War had many battles that had trenches dug? Well, O mighty Winged Hussar, during the Civil War, all of the major European powers sent military observers, and their reports often made it back to the high command. But
that's true. I mean, the Germans, the Prussians had observers there. That doesn't get talked a lot about during the American Civil War. But, you know, we know, if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, you know, they very famously show Colonel Arthur Fremantle of the Coldstream Guards from the British, who's kind of there as an observer. But all of, like he said, all of the major powers of Europe had observers, especially on the Union side, but also on the Confederate side.
The war and the reports seemed too alien and really too exotic to be considered for preparing their own strategies. The military observers were often actually really amazed by the scale of the U.S. Civil War and how quickly it escalated, and with things that would become, unfortunately, all too familiar in World War I, like barbed wire and trenches and submarines. And actually, both sides worked with submarines, even though they thought they were illegal. Both sides wrote, "No, it's an illegal weapon, it's cheating." But they
So the most famous example of a submarine is the H.L. Hunley, which is a Confederate submarine, and it had sunk a couple of times, including, I think, the first time they tried it out, it sank and killed all the crew members, but they pulled it back up, pulled the bodies out, and put it back in service again. And they had put a long, like, stick on the end of it with a bomb, basically. It was like, you know, an early version of a torpedo. And then they went out and they actually stuck it into the side of a ship and sank a ship that way. But unfortunately, they couldn't back out and get out of there, so they ended up sinking as well. They did recover the Hunley not too many years ago with the crew still inside. And they've been doing a lot of research on it, and I think you can actually see it now down in Charleston.
Still both worked on them. But also larger things like telegraph communications, linking telegraph communications, linking widening theaters of war, and making large-scale strategy and tactics possible in a way that they'd never been before.
Yeah, the telegraph thing is huge. Both sides had telegraph. It was much more extensive on the Union side. But you see, again, a perfect example of this is in the movie Lincoln, where you see that Lincoln's always down at the War Department with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and they're by the telegraphs and they're waiting for information to come in, from the battles for Fort Fisher down in North Carolina. And this was stuff that happened. I mean, they were getting almost real-time reports coming back as battles were happening. Now, it didn't always happen that quickly. So, for example, when Grant is on his Vicksburg campaign, there's very little information coming out because in order to send the telegraph, they had to get the message upriver back to Memphis and then up to Cairo, and then it had to be sent. And so there was a couple of days delay in messages there, but still much, much faster than had happened in previous wars.
Now, you have to remember, though, at that time, the 1860s or so, wars were still fought in the more traditional sense in Europe. If you look at the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, even the Crimean War back in the 1850s, those were all major engagements that were won with single decisive battles in the traditional sense.
Yeah, and the thing about that, this is where there's a big difference, I think, between someone like Grant and someone like Lee. Lee won a lot of battles, but I don't know if it was his mindset or it was just the nature of things, that he won a lot of decisive battles, but they didn't change the outcome of the war. They didn't change the way things went. Whereas Grant was all about the strategy, the overall strategy, which is moving all the armies at once in concert and winning campaigns. And that was the difference. I think Lee, he wins these battles, and maybe in other wars and maybe in Europe 40 years earlier, the way Lee won some of those decisive battles would have, determined the outcome of the war. You look at Napoleon, a lot of times he wins a big battle and that's it. The war's over between him and that particular nation. Not so in the American Civil War, or the Great War for that matter.
And if you look at the British Empire and the colonial powers who were used to fighting wars in the colonies, they weren't fighting modern war. Colonial war, as you know, was completely different. Actually, the American Civil War was not the best example where the First World War generals could have learned through hindsight. That would be the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, which also had trenches and machine guns, and all that was much more recent. But as we all know, they didn't learn.
So before we wrap this up, just want to take a look. There is one real prominent available source for how Europe viewed the American Civil War, and that comes from a Prussian observer who was reporting back to the Prussian military high command, specifically von Moltke. And his name was Justice Scheibert, and it says here, a Prussian observes the American Civil War, the military studies of Justice Scheibert, and it's actually available on Amazon for like $65. It's not something that I have myself, but there are some of what he said available online, the GettysburgCompiler.org website. And just to kind of give you a little bit of an insight into what he talked about, it talks about this quote that's been attributed to Moltke, where he says that the American Civil War was nothing but, quote, two armed mobs running around the countryside beating each other up, from which very little of military utility could be learned. But it says, while a proper source for this quotation cannot be pinned down and it may never have been uttered at all, it serves as a succinct description of how Prussians would ultimately view the military legacy of the Civil War. Now, Scheibert does go out of his way to praise Robert E. Lee, for example. He breaks down the war into three phases. He talks about the first phase, the opening days of the war being disorderly and confused, which is incredibly accurate, defined by haphazard skirmishes led by men who had not yet truly come to grips with warfare. That's absolutely true. These are guys that, for the most part, had not led troops of this size into combat. The second stage from 62 to Gettysburg in 63 represents a maturation of tactics, with special emphasis now being placed on learned battle formations, such as the offensive column, giving a sort of linear character to the fighting. The third phase from Gettysburg to the end of the war was focused on the defensive, also very true. This is where you get the trench warfare and things like that, at least from the Confederate point of view. So I think that's all pretty accurate. But it goes on to talk about how Scheibert says the loss of an upper-level commander, for example, would cripple advance and retard again in battle. So he observes how some things can be learned from that. For example, learn how to make sure you have better training for low-level officers in peacetime so that when those situations occur, someone is ready to step in. And you see this all throughout other wars. There's a great scene in the movie We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson and Sam Elliott, that talks about the Battle of Ia Drang, which was one of the first major battles the Americans were involved in the Vietnam War. And you see them training, and they're training to come in on helicopters. The helicopter lands, the guys get off, they fly out to go get more men. It's the 7th Cavalry. And so Mel Gibson's character, Hal Moore, comes up at one point as soon as the helicopter lands and says, "Bam, your officer's dead. What do you do?" And they all kind of freeze. And so he uses this as an example to say, listen, every person here, make sure that you know the job of the guy above you in the chain of command, and make sure you're teaching your job to the guy below you in the chain of command. And that's the same kind of thing that's happening here, is that Scheibert is saying, I've observed in the Civil War the breakdown in command that happens when a brigade commander goes down, when a division commander goes down. And that happened. There were situations, for example, at Gettysburg, where John Bell Hood gets severely wounded leading his division, and Evander Law, who was now the division commander, was all the way out on the right flank and didn't even know he had taken command of the division for quite some time. And so there's basically no command to that division as they're going into some really rough ground. And so that's one of the lessons that it seems the Prussians did learn, is to make sure that they do better training in peacetime so that when those kinds of things happen, they were prepared for it. And so it's an interesting read. If you find yourself curious about stuff like that, that'd be a great example of one of the things that you could learn about is by reading what Justin Scheibert had to say. And there were many others as well. So
Jim Bubley or Jim Boobly. Jim Boobly? What should we call him? Jim Boobly writes, "Great series. Thank you, Jim Boobly. I have a question for Out of the Trenches. Was there ever a time when an airship fought another airship? Probably impractical, but that would be an awesome fight." That's true.
Well, first of all, since we've been on the subject of the Civil War, the American Civil War is one of the first times you see the use of aerial reconnaissance. Both sides, the Union and the Confederates, used hot air balloons. On the peninsula, I think, was one of the first times you really see this done significantly, where they would use hot air balloons to try and get up high enough to be able to observe what was happening behind enemy lines. And, of course, they'd start shooting at them, but they would very quickly rise above the level where artillery or gunfire could get at them.
True, that'd be an awesome fight. I sadly have no knowledge of this, but it's an interesting question. Now, everybody knows about Zeppelins, but other nations had airships too during the war. The British used airships effectively to counter the U-boat campaign, the German U-boat campaign. But they were way behind the Zeppelins in design and technology until later in the war, when in many ways they were actually superior. True story. As weapons on board, they might have Lewis guns or bombs.
Lewis guns are machine guns, same ones that were used by the Australians in the Emu War. Didn't go so well.
Charges, and the crew would carry rifles sometimes to snipe mines that were spotted. Which
that's
is pretty
awesome.
Cool from this guy. They were great for having with convoys as spotters as well. During the entire war, only one ship was sunk while being escorted by an airship. The French army had a few airships that were used from 1915 for nighttime bombing raids, but eventually they were turned over to the Navy since they kept getting destroyed. The Italians used them too as scouts and bombers. But okay, I'm going on. The actual question, does anybody out there know the answer? Was there ever a time when like a German airship fought a British airship?
Can't think of it.
I don't know. Were there airship to airship battles? Tell us in the comments below. Fish and chimps, and that's fish like the band with a PH, and chimps as in, chimps. Fish and Chimps writes, "These generals had some fancy facial hair. What were the shaving requirements of the different countries involved? If in the trenches, were you still expected to shave daily?" Okay, I don't know very much about the shaving requirements of each of the varying nations, but the leaders and generals of all of the nations certainly sported some serious facial hair. Can we get a montage, okay? Ready for a montage? Rennenkampf, Konrad von Hotzendorf, Enver Pasha, General Ruski, Luigi Cadorna, Joseph Joffre, Sir Douglas Haig. Let's see.
So those are basically all of the, or a lot of the higher ranking, Hutzendorf is Austria-Hungary, Joffre is France, Haig is General-in-Chief for the British.
Serbian General Petar Bojovic. That's pretty much most of the European nations. If I left somebody out, sorry. Anyhow, one thing about the war, men in the trenches, they began shaving closely fairly often because gas masks do not fit well over beards and mustaches. They leak. And choosing between shaving and inhaling poison gas is a fairly easy choice. And when the men returned home, still clean-shaven, it became the popular fashion at home as well. Michael Gardner writes, I was thinking a good side video would be an introduction to the nations in the war. I am thinking as a teacher of American high school students. We're so far away culturally and geographically, the student who has even heard of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is rare even among students who like history. But even still, all of the common major powers are so different now than they were 100 years ago. It could help to have individual video on the major powers. What was their history? What was their government like? Their culture, their reputation? What were their war goals? How did that change throughout the war? That kind of thing. An excellent idea, Michael.
Yeah.
As you may have seen, we've already done some specials about a few countries involved in the war. Italy, Poland, South Africa, I know that. And we will indeed cover all of the major powers in the future. We should maybe have already, but, we still got time.
And I think that's a good idea as we work toward my trip here, and we're going to be taking a look at some of these sites associated with these places. I do want to get a little deeper into the background of some of these nations, what the government was like in those nations, who the leaders were, who are some of the main players that we're talking about, who are the generals on the ground, who are the political leaders, all those sorts of things. So if there's anything in particular you want me to cover on this channel related to those things, let me know.
Actually, if you want to see something about how a European power joined the war, I changed pages. If you want to see something about how a European power joined the war, you can click here for our episode about Italy. This time is... Okay, fine. You can click here for our episode about Italy. Yeah? Okay. Now, I really like that, like you, so many teachers watch and enjoy our shows, and we get letters from students, and we get comments from teachers, which is great. And if any of you out there know some teachers, especially history teachers, who don't watch our show, please recommend us to them. And don't forget to subscribe and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, and all of your dreams will come true, even the dirty ones. See you next time.
Okay, so that was a fun little look at a little bit of the connection between the American Civil War and Europe. I wasn't quite sure what to expect with that video since I hadn't watched it before, but let me know your thoughts about all of that. Do you see any great parallels between the American Civil War and the Great War of 1914 to 1918? Do you agree with him that there are other examples that are better, such as the Russo-Japanese War, or maybe the Franco-Prussian War, or some of the others that are better comparisons to what was to come in the Great War? Or was the Great War just kind of its own animal that was completely different than anything that came before or since? Use the comment section below, let me know. If you have any requests for videos you'd like to see me do in the coming days and weeks, let me know that as well. Thanks for watching.